let me introduce myself. My name is PJ Mouquin, and I've lived on Rockland Road since May of 1979. The Mouquin family bought the house back in 1902 from the estate of John W. Verdun. And I met my late husband, Charles Mouquin, in 1975 when I was working as a staff writer for Texaco Inc. And Bob Samuels, who was also working as a staff writer for Texaco Inc. And he is responsible for introducing me to my husband, Charles. And he was the best man in our wedding. So while I was raising my 3 children, I was very active in the Piermont Reformed Church. I taught Sunday school, and I served as a deacon and an elder and served on the General Synod, which was their national board. And I've also always been interested in historical research. So I found a lot of the information that I'm going to share with you in the archives of the Piermont Reformed Church. I was also a Girl Scout leader and served on the board of the Rockland County Girl Scouts and the Rockland County Historical Society. And some of the information that I'm going to share with you today is from an article that I wrote for South of the Mountain, this issue, which is the Rockland County Historical Society paper. And then other articles that I wanted to share are historical articles that I've written for the Piermont newsletter when Bob Samuels was still alive and served as the editor. So what I'm currently writing or working on right now include the book and lyrics to a musical called Hunchback. It was supposed to open in March of last year. However, the pandemic shut it down, so it's now been postponed and supposed to open at the Antrim Playhouse in November of 2021. So I've been also researching the history of the Mouquin family for the past 40 years. And I'm currently finally started writing the book about the Mouquin restaurants, which was pre-prohibition. Prohibition, they were the largest importers of wine in the United States. It's a picture of Charles's grandmother. It's a painting by William Glacken that was painted in 1905. That's Charles's grandmother, and I think that it's also behind me. You can almost see it there. I wanted to talk about the John Verdun house. My house was originally part of Piermont. This picture is from 1876 in the 1876 Centennial Atlas. And it's the house that I live in today, but it was then John Verdun's house. And it says on there that at that time it was in Piermont. So I don't know when it became part of Sparkhill. The house was built by what I think free blacks, Edward and Susan Jackson, in the 1800s. And in the basement of the house, you can see the original stone building, which John Verdun, when he bought it in 1850, he expanded it or built some stuff, and then he built more on it in 1873. He was, John Verdun was the one that Verdun Avenue was named after the Verdun family in Piermont, and William Verdun was his father, who owned the big Greek Revival house on the corner of Verdun Avenue and Rockland Road. And his parents lived there. He was, I think, in the church archive, the Piermont Reformed Church archives about John Verdun. It said he was trained as a lawyer at he went to Rutgers, but they said, owing to easy circumstances, he never practiced the law. He was actually maintained his large estate in Rockland, which part of it is now part of our property. William and John got involved in a feud that has to do with the history of the Piermont Reformed Church, which was opened in 1838. It was because they opened the Piermont Reformed Church as an outgrowth of the Tappan Reformed Church, where they were still holding services in Dutch. And so Eliezer Lord wanted one that would start in English, and the early church was up on the top of the hill. And the members who lived on top of the hill wanted the church to stay there. However, John and William Verdun owned property on what's now Verdun Avenue. And so they donated the property, and they also donated the architecture for the new church building, which was built in 1850. It was a 40 by 60-foot building. And then it moved down the hill to its present location. The article here shows a picture of John Verdun. And this picture here shows the basement of the house that I live in, which was originally the 1800 part of the house. It was, and then it was kind of gussied up in 1873. But in 1850, I don't know if anybody's watching the Underground Railroad, but in 1850, the fugitive slave law caused people to go underground. And in the basement of this house, behind a brick wall, which is the fireplace, there was a little tiny area where you could just fit maybe a cot, where they hid slaves back in that time. When John Verdun was a friend of John Tout, who was active in setting up the Underground Railroad in Rockland County. So he was very active in local stuff. He was he was elected to the Senate of New York State, John Verdun, in 1855, and became a delegate to the convention in Baltimore and nominated President Lincoln for the presidency. What I wanted to talk about was his sister, Catherine Verdun, who was born in 1818, because there is, many people know along Verdun Avenue, there is an old mausoleum. And it was built by William Verdun for his daughter, Catherine Verdun. And there is a road there, which is a private road, but you can walk up there, and on the right, you'll see this mausoleum that William Verdun built for his daughter, because she was dating a man who was the son of an engineer who was building the Piermont Pier. And the legend says that she could walk from her house up the back and up through what is now Tallman Mountain Park. And from there, they could get a view of the river and the pier that was under construction. Well, her father refused to allow her to marry the young man because he had no fortune. And so she was not forbidden to see him. And my friend and neighbor, James Rico, who lived in the William Verdun house, always talked about the Verdun sister who hung herself in the tower of the William Verdun house. Some people say she starved herself away or pined away after her father refused her to marry. But if in those days, if you committed suicide, you were not allowed to be buried in the church cemetery. And at that time, the Tappan Reformed Church Cemetery was the existing burial plot. So he built this mausoleum to put her in. And eventually there were 7 Verduns that went in there. And when Charles's grandfather bought the house in 1902, he moved all the bodies up to Rockland Cemetery. But the story goes that when William Verdun died in 1872, he said that he did not want any white man to darken his daughter's place of burial. So he insisted on having black pallbearers. And in the 1800s, it was common to have like a glass window on the top of the casket, so you could see the face. And her face had been beautifully preserved. But they said that when they moved his in, he banged, somebody knocked the casket and the beautifully preserved face fell to dust. This is the story. So, but when John Verdun inherited from his father, when his father died in 1872, and that's when he donated another 7,000 to the Piermont Reformed Church. And it looked like this then. It was a big tower and had a second floor with the balcony. And he used the same architect for that as he did for the crown molding. That kind of stuff was also, the same stuff was in that Piermont Reformed Church that burned to the ground, I think in 1947. In 1902, Charles's grandfather, Henri Mouquin, found out it was for sale. And it had been in terrible shape since John Verdun died. And it said the kitchen was originally in the basement. And my Charles's grandmother said the floor was so thick with ice that you could skate on it. So they bought the house in 1902. He'd already bought it when she said, let's not buy this house. And they put in the heating and plumbing and electricity back then. Piermont got electricity in 1900. So they did that. So I wanted to talk about one character in Piermont whose name was Arnold Fink. And he passed away, but I got to interview him in the Piermont newsletter. And he tells the story. He attended grades kindergarten through 12 in Piermont. And he remembers the story of his grandfather who was fatally shot in Piermont in 1900. His grandfather was Alfred Canerium, and he was born in Piermont in 1868. And by the time he was 32, he was the proprietor of the Washington Hall, which was a Piermont hotel in what is now known as the Turning Point. Al ran the bar in the basement while his 22-year-old wife, Carolyn, kept the rooms upstairs and tended the couple's 3 young daughters. Arnold Fink's mother, Catherine, was the oldest of the 3 daughters. And it was midnight on a sweltering hot Saturday night in August. A group of men had been drinking in the cool of the basement bar. Al started to close up his hotel, and a number of men went out into the street. At that point, a brawl broke out between Henry McDonald and 20-year-old Frank Quinlan. Frank, who was drunk, was taking a beating. Al was a friend of Frank's. He broke up the fight and walked him home. When they got there, Frank, who was furious about the beating, grabbed a shotgun and returned to the street, intending to shoot Henry McDonald. In a drunken rage, he fired over McDonald's head. Al was standing at the top of the stairs of his hotel with his hand on the doorknob, and the shots hit him in the leg, and he died of gangrene in Nyack Hospital the next day. As they prepared for the funeral, the Quinlan family was also mourning the loss of their home after of their son. A remorseful Frank Quinlan had staggered home, told his mother that he would never see him again because he had shot his friend Al by mistake. The newspaper reports that he was last seen in the direction of the pier. Frank committed suicide, they said, by jumping into the river. Arnold Fink moved to Piermont with his family in 1923, and they lived in a 2-family house across from the Piermont post office. Arnold remembers watching them raise and lower the old drawbridge behind the post office. And his father was the paymaster of the Robert Gare Company, the giant cardboard box factory that occupied the land where Piermont Landing stands today. Since there were no banks in Piermont, every Friday, the Piermont police would escort the paymaster round trip to the bank to Nyack to pick up the cash for the payroll. When he got back to his office, Walter would stuff the envelopes with cash for everyone who worked at the mill, Robert Gare Company. And he moved to Piermont in 1920 and took over the Piermont Paper Company that was organized in 1902. One of the stories that he told me was that, you know, where the rail bed is, we can walk now, and you walk over this big ravine. He said one of the things that the boys used to do was they would hang on underneath when the train went over. And I don't know how they did it, but that was one of the boys' things. And he was also he was active in the Boy Scouts in Piermont. And at that time, there was a Reverend Dr. William Berg was the Piermont Reformed Church minister. And he took the boys camping on his property in Vermont. And he said there was 8 of them. And Dr. Berg knew a fellow with a dump truck. And they piled all their camping gear into the dump truck and all of themselves. And they went out, no seatbelts, and they went up in the back of the dump truck to Vermont. He remembers going to the old Tappan Zee High School. And he said every morning he lined the boys up. The Lincoln Stewart was the custodian. And he lined the boys up in the basement locker room. Then he beat a yardstick against the door to march everyone upstairs to class. If you got out of step, he'd tap you on the backside with a stick. Oh, and this is the story about the cannon, which he tells me too. One day, Link found an old cannon on the shore of the Hudson. He hauled it up the hill to the school. He painted it and mounted it on a concrete base and had it pointing out toward the Hudson. It's now in Memorial Park. But the story that I wanted to share, which I think I heard from Ruth Jessup as well, was that they were going to move this cannon when they closed the Piermont High School and made Tappan Zee High School in Orangeburg. And they were, I think it was probably the time when they built the first town hall over there, probably in the 50s or 60s. And so some of the young men from the American Legion said, this cannon is not going to leave Piermont. So they hid it. I think they hid it in Ted Jessup's garage. I'm not sure where they hid it until people forgot about it. And, in Orangeburg at the old town hall, there's this like modern looking 60s freaky sculpture of a gun or a cannon or something, because they didn't have the cannon. And eventually they painted it and put it on a stand in what we call Memorial Park. So, and I don't know where the cannon came from, because they found it in the river. Could have come from a pirate ship or something. I think it's from the 18th century anyway. Okay, I wanted to talk about the so-called Birth of a Nation house. The William Verdun house was an 1830s Greek revival with the pillars and everything, and it does look like a Southern antique vellum house, which is why James Rico bought it in 1957. But he became very interested, of course, in art and architecture. And one of the books that I donated to the Piermont Library is called A Marble Quarry. And it is about the sculpture collection of James Rico. He was the largest collector of 19th century American sculpture in the country. And he had it all in the house down there until he died. And this is the booklet of his artwork that he collected of famous 19th century American paintings. And a lot of them were in museums. The Woman in Red, which is on the cover there, after he died, the Met Museum bought that one for $1 million. And anyway, so he was quite a character, and he lived there till his death in 1993. And he was a dear friend of my husband, Walter Kane, and Paula Rivero bought the house. It was 2000 sometime, and they started restoring it. And Walter became so interested in architecture that he actually quit his job and went to Columbia and got a master's in architecture and opened an architecture firm. But the house was referred to as the Birth of a Nation house. And the Birth of a Nation was an old black and white film. It was a 3-hour-long silent film. And it was about the, right after the Civil War, it takes place with what happened. But anyway, Walter bought it and restored it to what it looks like right now. When I was on the board of the Rockland County Historical Society, they did, I think it was for the 50th anniversary of the Tappan Zee Bridge, they did an article, or they did an oral history report. And they interviewed people who remembered, there were demonstrations and things about the building of the Piermont Pier. And Francis Pellegrini talks about that the Piermont Pier was originally going to come, no, the Tappan Zee Bridge was originally going to come through Tolman Mountain and through a piece of their property on Rockland Road. And so I interviewed Francis Pellegrini and Bob Samuels and Charles Mouquin and maybe Jack Geist for the history about the building of the Tappan Zee Bridge. And the Historical Society put out a book, and it has a CD in the back with the interviews. I mean, other people, other board members also did interviews. And you might want to get copies of those interviews and put them together with the Piermont Library. Oh, no, I didn't tell you about Charlene and Dick Stern in the castle. Well, that castle that we, the Piermont, you had some beautiful fundraiser up there. And currently the Shaw family owns it, and they've restored it, including the unfinished room. But the castle was originally Eleazar Lords, who was the president of the Erie Railroad. And he built the original part of the building in 1845. And his first wedding was 3 months after he moved in. He had 9 children, and only one, Sarah Pearson Lord, survived, and she married William Henry Whiten, which is why it became the Lord's Castle became known as the Whiten family. And both lords died there in 1870. He died in 1871 at the age of 84, and his wife died 3 years later at the age of 73, after 3 weeks of fearful suffering, terribly burned by clothing taking fire from a spark from the stove. Now the wood stove is still in the castle where she was burned, but no, Charlene and her husband, Jerry Eichelheimer, bought the castle in 1968 and lived there until just a few years ago. And she did a lot of research about the castle's architects, Mouquin, Mead, and White. And she found a very funny article in the New York Historical Society. She found a 1903 letter from Mary Thaw Thompson. And she wrote to Mouquin, Mead, and White that she had just bitterly complaining about the leaks in the castle since the first winter, and that it had spoiled all her new painting and all the work that she had done by stonemasons and roofers without much success. And she held the firm responsible. So Mouquin, Mead, and White came up, and they threw a bucket of water on the stone. And they were amazed that this local stone that was constructed at the castle, it just went right through the stone. So neither she nor Charlene's 2 husbands were able to fix it. But I understand the Shaws got some modern technology, and they finished the parlor that was never finished, and they also repaired the roof. So they did a lot. But Charlene had it, and she had 8 weddings and 3 full-length films made there. In this, at the time of writing this, and the last film was Woody Allen's Sweet and Low Down, that she did. But also, I mean, it helped pay. I mean, Piermont raised her taxes considerably in it, and she had films crews coming in all the time to help pay the taxes. That was good money for her. And she, after her second husband died, her son moved her down to Asheville, North Carolina, to be closer to him. So the castle was sold. But it's a beautiful architectural thing.